Well, hello everybody, and welcome to this wonderful AAAS event being collaboratively held by the section on Social, Economic, and Political Science, Section K, and Section X on the societal impacts of science and engineering. I'm Barbara Schneider. I'm the John A. Hanna University Distinguished Professor in the College of Education and Department of Sociology at Michigan State University. And I was a past chair of Section K. So I'm really very pleased to be here today to serve as the co-moderator of this important conversation with Dr. Nelson. Although I was intending to be one of you and sitting over there, it didn't quite work out that way because Felice Levine, who is the executive director of AERA and Section K's current chair, unfortunately got COVID, and she is in isolation. So I was called in to kind of pitch hit here. Anyway, I would like to also give a welcome to our people from Section X. First of all, Adriana, who's a senior fellow for science policy with the Federation of American Scientists, who is also the membership engagement chair for Section X. She will be joining me and Dr. Nelson in our living room when we start our interactive part of this event. And I would also like to say thank you to Mike Holland, who's Section X chair, and Richard Lampert, who is Section K secretary, and a very good friend of mine who gets me out of a lot of trouble, for their important roles and being with us today in person. And I'm really happy to see all of you here in person. Well, today we're really thrilled to host a conversation on big issues for science policy in a challenging world with Dr. Nelson. I'm especially honored to introduce Dr. Nelson, who is among a long list, whose list goes on of notable accomplishments, and who served in the Biden-Harris administration as acting OSTP director and as the first ever deputy director for science and society. Now, a little bit about Dr. Nelson, please. Dr. Nelson is the Harold F. Linder Professor at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton University and an acclaimed sociologist of science, technology, and social inequality. She is a distinguished senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, former dean of the social sciences at Columbia University, and former president of the Social Science Research Council, and she began her whole career at Yale University. I have to give a plug for those places. Included in the list of the 10 people who shaped science in 2022, Nature said of her, "This social scientist, while she was at OSTP, made strides for equity, integrity, and open access," which for many of us here is really a key and drives our work. An acclaimed researcher, Alondra is the author of several books, including The Social Life of DNA, has essays, reviews, and commentaries that have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and Science. She is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Philosophical Society, the Council of Foreign Relations, and the National Academy of Medicine. Well, it is really a pleasure to welcome you up here for a short talk and then a conversation hour. Please.
much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Barbara, for that introduction. I want to send my best wishes to Felice Levine, who is under the weather and who's been such a great partner. I think more for the last decade. I've worked with her closely, including in my time at the Social Science Research Council. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Richard, for being here and for the invitation to join you. And I'm glad to have this occasion to sort of join the work of these two important AAAS sections together in this conversation. Also, I'm proud to be a member of both Sections K and Sections S, a fellow of AAAS and also a former board member. So I feel like it's like a family reunion in some regards. Continuing that theme, I want to say a special welcome to former OSTP colleagues who are here, Max and Hawa and Joel and Kay. Thank you so much for coming and so enjoyed our work together. And Kay, of course, is a living legend at AAAS and elsewhere besides as well. So let me just say a few words about, it was like one of the greatest pleasures of my life to have the honor of working in the Biden-Harris administration, in part because I think this administration has brought a new way of thinking about innovation and a new way of thinking about how we do science and technology policy to the fore that I think is tremendously exciting. Part of that, of course, comes out of the fact or emerges from the fact that this administration came into office with, first in 100 years pandemic, in the midst of a racial reckoning, in the midst of a climate crisis, all of which are still kind of bubbling around us, and all of which required science and technology policy at the table to resolve, to mitigate, and required us, I think, as a society to think in new ways about how we do that work. So it's been clear that from day one, when the Biden-Harris administration issued its very first executive order on its very first day in office, that was the executive order on equity. Those of you who've been in DC a long time know that that first executive order on that first day is intended to be a kind of cornerstone for the work. And that meant for our work in science and technology policy and in research policy that was a cornerstone for that work as well, I think for the very first time in a really marked way. So innovation in science and technology policy for a purpose, innovation for a purpose has played a leading role in the Biden-Harris administration's agenda. And I want to suggest that key to this has been a kind of overarching perspective that scientific research and technological development offer a value proposition, right? Opportunity, economic opportunity, national security, and a values proposition with an S to the American public. Ezra Klein, writing in the New York Times last year about the Biden-Harris administration's science and technology policy, would say the following. This is a quote: every big bill Biden has passed has carried a theory of how better policy could lead to better technologies that could lead to a better world. Close quote. Or said another way, behind each major policy initiative is an idea about an enriched society, right? A better society. I think this strategy is showing early signs of success. I think we can talk and debate about this this morning, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Obviously, the administration has been engaged in what some are calling a modern American industrial strategy, and some of the signal policy achievements of the last year include the establishment of the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health, AAAS, the act that made that possible, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the CHIPS and Science Act. All of these leverage targeted public funding, infrastructure investment, and science and technological innovation to strengthen economic opportunities and ensure the Americans' public's well-being broadly. So the IRA, for example, is incentivizing the manufacture and adoption of advanced batteries, electric vehicles, heat pumps, and other technology in the US, so crucial to addressing the magnitude of the climate crisis. The CHIPS and Science Act, I hope we'll talk about that, is driving the revival of the American semiconductor research, development, and manufacturing ecosystem. And ARPA-H, this new health agency, is employing a high-risk, high-reward medical discovery ethos in partnership with academia and industry, using platforms, capabilities, and resources that should be potentially applicable across many different diseases. Each of these also has a values proposition, right? This idea that underlying all of these is the principle that the benefits of science, research, and innovation should redound to the American public in full. In the case of ARPA-H, President Biden described its mission as intended to, and this I'm quoting him, leverage the powers and possibilities of science and technology to benefit all of America, and to focus on equity because every American should have access to cutting-edge healthcare innovations, close quote. Similarly, the IRA includes a vision for society in which people can afford pharmaceuticals they need to live, and a clean energy transition that brings everyone along on the path to net zero by 2050 while addressing longstanding environmental justice issues. And the CHIPS and Science Act invests in and endeavors to secure the lives and livelihoods of the American public by building and bolstering technology supply chains, weaving the democratization of opportunity into its implementation, including into often neglected regions of the US through STEM education, employment, and research opportunities done equitably to historically underserved rural communities, tribal communities, communities of color, and others. And I want to acknowledge my colleague Travis York from AAAS, who is leading the great STEM Opportunity Alliance that we were so pleased to help launch during my time at the White House. So, Ezra Klein, in writing about reflecting on the Biden-Harris administration's sort of big policy investments, cautions against science and technology policy that is trying to sort of drive an opportunity imperative, or a values proposition. He called this everything bagel liberalism. So he said, are we trying to just pile everything onto science policy, and suggest that these priorities should not be combined lest we risk not accomplishing any of them. But I want to make the case that each of these new laws are inherently going to make transformative infrastructure and research investments that will undoubtedly shape fields, sectors, and markets. And they will have the intended benefit of aiding, supporting, bolstering the economy, workers, communities, and families, and therefore will have a series of knock-on effects for society. As James Webb, the now controversial former administrator of NASA would say in his retrospective reflections on his time in government and the societal impact of the agency's work, and quoting him, is it necessary to proceed in the blind, as it were, with regard to the possible second and third order effects of substantial, ambitious, large scientific endeavors? I would say, and I'm done quoting him, the answer is, of course, no. Clearly, and I think a part of what this administration is trying to do prudently, government can and should do more. It can strategically steward science and technology investments and commitments, not only to mitigate risks, but also to enable optimal outcomes for the most people, including those historically marginalized and presently disadvantaged. Rather than passively hoping that maximum social benefit and minimum social disarray will trickle down as an emergent property of science and innovation and research, these conditions can be strategically stewarded through policy innovation of the type that I think the Biden-Harris administration currently has underway. So I want to offer that a better description for the Biden-Harris approach might be lodestar liberalism, foregrounding all of the aspirations that policy is intended to accomplish and using these principles as a guide to how it should be operationalized. So let me talk, with this perspective in mind, I think that we can think about science and technology policy. We can think about something I've been thinking about quite a lot since leaving government, AI policy, AI governance, and sort of ask, as we're thinking about policy issues, kind of what is that lodestar? How can we use technology investment, scientific research to advance democratic values, to advance our common humanity, to advance and expand our rights and freedoms and opportunity? How do we do that at the center? I think that's the new values proposition that this administration has been offering, and in a fresh new way for thinking about science and technology policy. So I just want to plant a flag, and I'll stop speaking, for a few things that we might talk about. We see this, of course, in the Cancer Moonshot. The pillars of the Cancer Moonshot deeply invested in scientific research in ways that you would anticipate, but also has a through line throughout those pillars that's about sort of equitable access for communities with rare diseases, for communities that don't have access to screening technologies, for communities that have not been involved in clinical trials for reasons that are both historical and contemporary. We see this, of course, in the guidance from OSTP that is trying to expand public access to federally funded research, which we might talk about as well. We see this, of course, in the implementation of things like the Competes Act and some of the work in open government that is intended to extend that work, but not just assume that to say government is open means that everyone feels welcome to come to the table and participate in that work. And so what is incumbent upon government and policymakers to do, and some of these tools were built out in the Obama administration, challenges, the ability to email offices and these sorts of things. How do we make the work of science and technology policy in a time of, sadly, waning distrust in science, waning distrust in democratic institutions? How do we bring more voices in, make our work more transparent, and hopefully also more legitimate? So I'll stop there, and I look forward to the conversation with Barbara and Adriana. Thank you very much.
So we're going to switch now to a different part of what we have for today, which is to have a living room kind of discussion. And that is something we will lectures from the floor. And there are mics on either side for those of us that are here in person. In addition to that, we also have Dr. George Wimberly, who is going to be fielding the questions that we have from people who are online. Now, the interesting thing about that is we had 255 people that registered for this event. Now, we all know not everybody comes, but I think knowing that it was you and that you were going to be speaking and how important these issues are today, that it's really a wonderful sign that there was their kind of interest. So thanks again for all of you out there in the internet. I'd also like to say thank you once again to my co-host, Adriana, who absolutely is wonderful, and she is going to be joining me as we try and field questions. Now, to get us started, I had a message from Felice this morning, which I thought, this is really interesting, and you raised it at the very end of your talk. And when I was thinking about this whole idea about the lodestar, and then in the New York Times today, there's this piece about distrust in institutions and how it's growing, and distrust in science particularly. And we're all here as people who believe in science, who work in science and work in science policy, or actually do bench work ourselves. And I think that my first question to you is, well, what can we do? I mean, we need to have an action plan to find a way to bring back trust in our institutions and in what we do. So that would be my first question to you.
That's the hard question, but I think it's an important question for this moment. So I think the first thing I would say, you might disagree, and I would love to hear what you think, is that we need to, I think, make policy, do our work, those of you working in government still govern, accepting that we are in a low trust environment, right? And so I think that we can't, as much as we want to wish, back and look back to the halcyon days where we felt like there was high trust. I think we just have to accept that that's the case and sort of operate from that perspective and hope that some trust can be earned back by science and scientists, by institutions, by democracy and the like. So I think we just need to, the work that it's going to take, I think, to restore things requires that we be looking forward instead of looking back. And then I think also be looking very clear-eyed about what we're dealing with. And that's a low trust environment. So then what does that mean in the space of, I think, thinking about, policy making for those in government and policy advice? It means, we look at the behavioral science and social science research. We know it's a very complicated problem. There is not, there's not a Freakonomics solution here, right? There's been some interesting experiments, but there's not a kind of one solution. And I think we try the things that we know that work and understand that it might take a long time to sort of turn the tide. And some of the things that we know that work are that we, and I think we tried to do this administration has tried to do this fully, and we've tried to do it in my time at OSTP, and it's still going forward, just to be more transparent in our work, to sort of say that the public, even if they're not expertise in science or technology, are stakeholders in this conversation, and that they should have access to papers, they should have access to the process that we're going through, some of the conversations that are taking place, and hope that that will do a little bit to change the tide. But I think it's going to be a lot of work for a lot of people over time. And there's downsides to that increased transparency, right? I mean, people misread papers, spin things off into the theories that are, that may or may not be, based in what was actually happening. But I think that's the cost of it, because I think around government and also around our institutions of science, peer review, and the way that the kind of norms of our work is a broader social ecosystem that thinks about information in different ways, right? That shares it broadly, that, we know from some of the social science data that there's sort of varying ideas about privacy based on generation. So we can't keep doing the same thing. And I think it's been great for carrying forward some of the work, say, from the Obama administration to sort of take those open government tools and policymaking as one way to do it. But I think there's other, certainly part of the impetus of, the president's commitment to public access to research is also this. It's about driving innovation, but it's also about not, storing away from the public things that they want to know, should know, have supported.
Well, thank you. That was great. I'm going to turn now to Adriana, and she has a whole lot of things she wanted to ask you, and people she's hoping are going to stand and come to the mics as well.
Excellent.
So in your remarks, you talked about how chips implementation and how we need to bring more young voices into science. And so my question relates to the scientific workforce, how we can build a diverse and inclusive scientific workforce, and to train them to be able to ask questions that are based on evidence, and bring more folks into the field.
Yeah, so I name-checked a few colleagues from OSTP who are here, so I hope they will come to the mic if they want and weigh in, because some of them are working in real time on this issue. I mean, lots to say about chips and science. First, yay, right? I didn't think it was ever going to happen. And, I remember looking at Kay here, I remember being at OSTP the day when it became clear that legislation was going to move forward. I mean, it was a lot of hurry up and wait, and we weren't sure. And then all of a sudden there was a thing, and we were just wait, what just happened? And immediately, we had to sort of think about implementation and what that means. So, clearly all of that Chips and Science Act, the in science part, hasn't been appropriated, and there's a lot of work that still needs to be done by folks in this room to really dig in and push forward the full vision of that legislation. But I think it's really part of what I was trying to convey in my remarks is that what I think is so I think quite extraordinary about it is that it's willing to say, yes, we've got international competition in the semiconductor space, but we want to try to build this out in a way that offers strategic, prudent opportunities for people in the American public. And, I think it's going to happen anyways. I mean, if you build new factories and build fabs and all of these things, communities are going to shift, resources, it creates these kind of political economies. And why not do it in a way that's intentional? And so that's what I think is the promise of the Chips and Science Act, if we can pull it off. We face a lot of challenges. I mean, we've got challenging in the policy space, a challenging immigration climate right now, which means that until, politically that gets figured out, until we can bring more scientists from, abroad, nurses, doctors, bench scientists, technologists, and the like, that's a challenge. And it's also an opportunity to really invest in the domestic workforce, to upskill, to train, to offer opportunities to the domestic workforce, which I think the conversations, around AI, there's a growing kind of sense that we need to do that in that space as well. And so, all the more reason as that legislation, I think, endeavors to do at its best to invest in tribal communities and rural communities and communities that are not on the coast. And we have a great opportunity to make that true and sort of see what it looks like to sort of have that fullness of opportunity kind of redound to to the broader public.
Thank you. So do we have a question, Rob? Oh, Rich.
We've got Dr. Lampert here.
Yes.
Hi, Dr. Nelson. In both your research and your career, I think there's no one who more than you embodies the intertwining of the social, behavioral, physical, natural sciences and equity within these sciences. It's almost like you decided to bring them all together. Today, with the demise of affirmative action and with this very strong push against even non-affirmative action ways of advancing diversity, equity, and the like within these sciences, we are perhaps at a crossroads. I have two questions relating to this. The first question is, how do you assess the situation? What do you think? Do you see a crisis? Do you see opportunities? And the like, where are we heading? And the second, closely related, is what can those of us who are concerned, us researchers and others, do to push back against the effort to dampen equity and diversity and inclusion efforts? And in particular, what kind of role would the research that scientists do play in this?
That's a great question. What an important question. So from a fellow sociologist, I will answer a little bit to start in a kind of sociological way, which is like, I think that we need to understand the debates about affirmative action and even the recent legislation in the broader context where Dr. Schneider where we began, right, with distrust in institutions. And, I would want to also bring to the table of our conversation book banning and this sort of sense that there's knowledge that can't be known or shouldn't be known. And so Dr. Lampert, I don't know that I would use the word crisis about affirmative action in particular, but I think that there's probably, I think that many of us can agree that there's a bigger crisis around the legitimacy of knowledge-making institutions and the sort of the production of knowledge. I think that part of what we're seeing with, book bans and these sorts of things are part of that larger conversation. So I would say, one of the things I think that's interesting when you work in the space of tech policy in particular, a little bit different from research and science policy, and I think really emerges out of, I think, the work that we did in OSTP and the work I've been doing since as a policy advisor around AI policy and governance, is that policies need to change, right? So that they exist in sort of dynamic spaces. And, when you're looking at a cycle of transformation, like something like AI, the thing that we need to root in is the lodestar, the guidelines, not the policies themselves. And so I think while I sort of, while I, as a beneficiary of affirmative action, while I grieve the kind of spirit that and the sort of lack of, I think, generosity and appreciation for how this country was founded and established to the present, and the commitments to that, to democracy and equal access in these things. I also appreciate that policies need to change. And so, there's been demographic change in the United States. I think, it'd be interesting to know what Travis thinks. I mean, it would be great to have better data on what programs work and which don't. I also think it's the case in the world of science and research that we know that diverse teams are better, right? And so we're just not going to have great innovative science if we don't have diverse teams. And you can, call it what you will or accomplish it, I think, in lots of different ways, but that's just a truism of, I think, innovation. So I'd offer those as a few quick results.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Yes, thanks very much. I'm Jeff Alexander with RTI, the Research Triangle Institute. I do a lot of work in R&D funding program evaluation. We're having these generational increases in investments in science and technology. The phrase or the question I get that bothers me the most is people immediately ask me, well, what is the return on investment from those investments, which I find to be an extremely bad lens to use. So I'm just curious, if somebody were to ask you that question, what is the return on these investments? What would be your way of maybe redirecting the conversation in a more constructive way?
I think I would go back to some of my remarks, actually, and the sort of the sort of broader societal effects that we hope science to have. And you can't measure that in an ROI kind of frame. But that said, Mr. Alexander, I would offer that we should be able to have some and better metrics, right? I mean, I think part of what we tried to pick up in my time at OSTP was the earlier work that had been done and sort of fallen away on the science of science. I mean, we can be doing much better on our analytics about like where resources go and what they're yielding. But we should also be, I think, just honest about the fact that we can't measure everything, on the scale of as an endeavor, an entity as large as the U.S. federal government. The implication, that work goes everywhere, right? USAID has work all over the world. I mean, like our science and technology enterprise is like truly global. And so I think that the question would be, why do we want to measure? What are the things that we want to measure? And be specific about those things. And do we have the data that we need to do that? And then to also appreciate that some of the return on investment might not be realized for a generation or two. Like some of the investments that we're making in the STEM fields, for example, or even in basic research. I mean, some of those investments take a generation or more to sort of yield. And so it also just seems like the wrong question for the domain, but not a totally bad question, I would say. Thank you for that.
Thank you. We have someone over here. Yes, please.
Thanks very much, Dr. Nelson, for being here, and thanks very much to our hosts. I'm Shailin Jyotishi. I'm Senior Advisor on Education and Labor at New America. My question is about the intersection of emerging technology and labor and worker power. We've seen this very month the United Auto Workers strike and electrical vehicle tension, and in Hollywood, the Writers Guild of America and tension around AI. A Gallup poll suggested that 3 out of 4 Americans are concerned that AI will reduce employment more so than increase it, and they distrust businesses to use AI responsibly. What should we be thinking about in terms of ensuring that these federal investments in R&D result in good jobs for the American people?
Thank you for that question. Such an important question. So the first thing I would say, and folks might have heard me say this elsewhere, is that, I think part of the work of civil society and the work of government is to offer different choice architectures for the public about what the future might look like. And I think what's been disturbing to me, since I left government in February about the public conversation is this sort of sense of inevitability. Like there's going to be no jobs, people will be cast to the wind, just these kinds of narratives as if there's nothing that we can do about it. And as if there's nothing that, that the role of government is not in part to provide ballast and to buffer when there are kind of broad social transformations, as if there's not worker agitation, as if there's not workers, working right now to say, we don't want our jobs to look like that, next month, next year, and 5 years from now. And so I think that we really need to, in the civil society space and those who are working in government currently, really open our imaginations to other kinds of possibilities. And I think the work is important, not only because of things like economic security and economic development. Work anchors our lives. Work is part of our identity. So to the extent, to go back to Barbara's really important first question, we care about cohesive democracies in which people gain and build trust. Part of that happens in the community of doing work, of feeling that you have an anchor in your community and your job and your life. And so while it might be the case, I think at its best, and I think many of us are hopeful for this, that new automated technologies and AI may bring new productivity gains, may make work that is currently unsafe from some workers safer, that there might be really beneficial transformations down the line, ways to augment our work and that make us better at the things that we do. It's also the case that, we've got to understand that work is not just about the sort of labor exchange. That work is one of the anchors of how we build democratic community, and that we need to hang on to it for that reason as well. And I think, of course, obviously, we need to be thinking about I would add to your list. So you talked about the screenwriters and writers guild, and you talked about the auto workers. We should add the Amazon workers here as well. So part of this larger kind of, I think, issue space is obviously issues of surveillance and speed ups for workers as well, that these automated tools help to advance. So I think it's a really big place for policy thinking, and I'm glad that you at New America are doing that work.
Yes, Pete.
I thank you very much for a wonderful talk and it's stimulation for a lot of questions. I'm Elon Chifan. I'm at Arizona State University here in D.C.
Talk about innovation. Here we go.
Yeah. You just recently mentioned two words that to me are quite important. One is narratives and the other one is imagination. And my question is really about education. And the question that if we are dealing, as we are obviously, with highly complex issues in our society, whether that's technological or it's social, and it's usually a mixture. The question is, how do we begin to bring that into the education rather than segregating these pieces so that, in fact, people are even more confused because they've never seen it brought together as you in your own career have done. And frankly, so have I. The question is, how do we put together arts, social science, natural science, humanities, in the sense that as children grow up, they already see this not as an insurmountable, fuzzy, complex thing, but something that they can approach and that they see in their lives every day.
Thank you for that question. I mean, and also, ASU has been such a leader in this space and bringing all of these disciplines and fields that are often siloed together. I would say that the answer, Elon, lies part in what you already said, which is that this is how young people already think about their lives, right? And they move across the domains of video games to working on a paper to using ChatGPT to being on their iPhones kind of seamlessly in a way that none of us have. I mean, we talk about the younger generation, younger than many of us of the digital natives. We now have another generation beyond, right, who've just like their whole world has been, in the world of clouds, like, things moving from one device to another, the bigger data capability that clouds provide and these sorts of things. And so I think we've got to take our lead from them in some ways, precisely as you say. And I think we can learn a lot from sort of switching that perspective around. I mean, it is, as a teacher, certainly I think those of us who are teachers are always humble. You get like at the beginning of every semester, when I was on the faculty at Columbia, you would get this sort of 10 things that you should know about the class of 2028 or whatever that's coming in. And it would just be these kind of mind-blowing statistics, like they've never seen a telephone and they've never, they never like used a personal computer in the way, just these sorts of things. And, we just have quite a lot to learn. And I think the sort of pedagogical relationship has to be reimagined such that it is much more dialogic and mutual.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have, yes, and from OSTP, and my understanding is that there were a number of people that came from OSTP that have wanted to get into this conversation. So I'm encouraging you, please just stand up. You got an invitation from our wonderful, wonderful speaker, and now we're giving you another invitation. So please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much. My name is Max Bronstein. I'm former OSTP, just for the record, now working in biotechnology. But thank you to AIR for hosting this conversation. Thank you for Dr. Nelson for being here. I had a question about sort of the political environment of science policymaking. And after having worked at the White House, which doesn't get any more political than that.
What do you mean?
What advice would you offer to either to scientists or to science advocates who are trying to sort of get scientific messages out there, but having to do it in a world that is increasingly political? And sometimes it's hard to get your point across given people's sort of pre-existing political worldviews about science and science policy issues. So would welcome any advice you might have on that.
Gosh, I mean, I would take advice from you. I think I would go back to the question, part of my first answer to Barbara, which is like, we just have to admit that that's true. I think that we spend a lot of time lamenting that there was, and maybe this is not even true, but lamenting that there was a time where you could just talk about science and talk about technology policy and all this other stuff wasn't happening. So as a social scientist, I know that's not true, but I do recognize that people experienced it maybe in the science advocacy world as true in their experience, that you could go and talk to a staffer or somebody at the White House and it would just not be, political considerations would have a kind of backbench in the conversation. And so we're just not in that world anymore. And I think that means that we need to think about bipartisan opportunities. I was going to sound very Pollyannish, but I think that that's true. I mean, I think to the extent that science and technology policy plays a role in helping and saving people's lives and helping people get jobs and, helping people get educated, it is this kind of small Venn diagram of bipartisan possibility. If we think about things like the PACT Act or ARPA-H, like where you were able to get folks working together a little bit, and even Chips and Science, right, was like, part of why that omnibus is so massive is because it's got a lot of perspectives included inside of it. So I do often see science policy as a space of possibility. I think it even as it's in this, it feels for advocates more polarized than ever. I think the issue space is one in which there's more possibility than in other spaces. Immigration, you can name a million other things where you're just never going to get any overlap, where there's some potential overlap. And so I hope that, that advocates can sort of take that to heart and strategically use that in the way that they frame their work.
Thank you. Well, we have our virtual folks with us as well. Dr. Wimberly, would you like to give us one of our questions from our online community, please?
Okay. Our virtual audience is very busy here with questions and compliments. First, not only thanking you, Dr. Nelson, for your talk, but the first question is a core question from AAAS Section K and that perspective. At what stage and how are sociologists, anthropologists, and ethicists, as well as community members, included in the design process? And then go on with a comment of values propositions would benefit from those who work in values be part of the team from day one, not just looking at past research.
So I think that part of the process, I guess, in policy design, I think is the implication of the question. I'll just take that to be the case. A couple of things. I mean, as Barbara mentioned, I was really proud to sort of stand up this first Office of Science and Society at OSTP. And I think that there's appreciation not only in the White House, but across the executive, that, you need lots of different perspectives and in space of science and technology policy. And some of the big questions that we have, so if we think about, when this administration took office, and it's a debate we're still having around vaccines. I mean, it was very, I've said this elsewhere, we decoded the virus, SARS-CoV-2, CoV-2 in less than a month. We had a vaccine in less than a calendar year. And yet you couldn't get it in arms, right? And those are questions of social and behavioral science. And so it's very clear that government needs to sort of take that as part of its work. I would also add that one of the fascinating things about when my appointment was announced, both as this new division or directorate of science and society, and also that I was a social scientist doing this role. There were a lot of people who already worked in government who were social scientists that sort of reached out. So there was this sort of like silent minority, silent majority. I don't know what they are, what the size of them who was like, I'm a, epidemiologist, or I'm a public health this, or I'm a sociologist or, economist sort of working across the interagency. And so I think I would say, and part of what we try to do at OSTP is that there's already a lot of social and behavioral science expertise in government. It's pretty rich and deep. They're working in a lot, they don't have a job that says I'm the sociologist of the Department of Energy or something like that, but they're kind of throughout the interagency doing really important work. And so I think it's also the case that people are already there and they're already involved in the design of policymaking and sort of thinking through these issues. And that's not to say that there can't be and shouldn't be more, but I would just offer that it's already a significant part of the conversation.
Let's take, Adriana, you had another question that you wanted to ask, and then we'll get back.
Well, I have lots of questions, but little time.
We know where to find you.
So I want to bring us back to this question of research investments. There has been a rising international competition in R&D from the European Union, from China, from India. And so we're going to think about how we can make choices about where to invest in research, how to do this in a timely fashion to ensure that we maintain our competitiveness in science technology and also foster international collaboration.
Good question. Yes, yes, we need to collaborate. I think it depends on the research field in some regards, right? I think there are issues of, you might call them sort of UN level or UN framing issues around climate, around pandemics, for example, that really require kind of, planetary collaboration, and that I think, require us to sort of think outside of the space of competition, because the sort of risks or the challenges are such that we need to, I think, have a different and new frame around things. But there are also certainly places of scientific research development where, where folks in government might say you want to work with like-minded countries, right, where there are risks to IP, where there are risks to, security, economic or national security, that one wants to think about that in different ways as well. I would say, one of the, I've always been inspired by John Holdren's work, who was a former OSTP director, and his work with Pugwash, and really trying to think about, moments of Cold War, moments of heightened competition, where doors to research collaboration are open, and what are the windows that you can keep open? And so I would also encourage us to think about the spaces where we can leave possibilities of collaboration open and not assume that heightened competition in one space sort of shuts down the entire possibility for collaborative research, and to be looking for those opportunities to do that.
Thank you. Okay, George, you're on.
Another question from our virtual audience here. How do we ensure those who are most marginalized and most likely to be negatively affected by the technologies under development, particularly AI systems, have not just a seat at the table, but a centered and directing voice in how these technologies are guided, built, and regulated?
That is the question of our day. I guess because I'm sitting in DC, one of the things I would say is vote. I think different administrations take quite different and sometimes polar perspectives on the role of the public in these conversations. Some are more likely to, to sort of only be driven by industry rather than being driven by, industry, civil society, a certain kind of orientation to, to the public. So I think that it really matters. The other thing I would say is that the issues around disproportionate or exacerbated risk from technology and science are not new, that we've known about them a long time. There's a lot of historical work. There's a lot of contemporary social science work in this space. I think AI debates in the public sphere have been an opportunity to sort of, over the last 3 or 4 years, as we've come to face with algorithmic bias and discrimination issues, have sort of raised this to the forefront. But we know about experimentation with Native American communities. We know about the Tuskegee syphilis study, which was sponsored by the U.S. Public Health Service, right, by the U.S. federal government. Many of these are work that has been advanced by the government. And so first of it is just to be, I think, forthright about the fact that these risks have always been there in the scientific ecosystem, and that we've got a responsibility to do something about it. And then there's got to be, I think, some humility on the part of the scientific research community, and also some courage, right? The courage means that you're bringing people into conversation with you who don't have the same sort of trajectory of, getting PhDs like many of us in the room, who don't have the same expectations or sort of normative expectations around research. But I think offer a great insight and I think innovation to the way that we think about our work. And so how do we do it? It's really hard. I mean, I think that the power we've seen, some of the work that we did at OSTP was about engaging Native American and Indigenous, Native Alaskan communities in our work, and thinking about Indigenous knowledge in that work. Some of the work that we've endeavored to do, in my time in government, was using challenges and other sorts of vehicles to get people's voices. But that's it's hard work. It's harder. It takes longer. We've got to be patient. It's much easier to get, 5, computer scientists in a room to tell you what to do about a particular policy. And the hard work, I think, in the front ends will help us in the back end, because it means, I think, hopefully that we make policy decisions that are prudent and therefore kind of more effective in the end.
Okay. George, did you have another one before we switch back to?
Sure. Another question. This is going back to the issue of trust. What new insights can social sciences give us into the politics of trust that seem to be how various institutional things view the physical, biological world and its challenges, especially around things around climate change and vaccine opposition?
Right. I think I've mostly answered that. Yeah, there's a lot of social and behavioral science literature growing. There's old literature like Nicholas Luhmann on trust, but there's also kind of new experiments and research. It's a pretty complicated problem, and we know that some interventions work in the way that you communicate science, for example, but the issue of trust is about much more than interventions and how you convey information. And I think we've got to kind of work in lots of different institutions kind of simultaneously on building that back. And I think I would say, one of the more interesting things about the working in the early days of the Biden-Harris administration, we had, as some of you know, President issued in the first week a presidential memorandum on scientific integrity. But the sort of title of it was something like promoting the scientific integrity and promoting trust in government or something. And so I would say, one of the bets that's being made here is that having science that is more robust and more transparent, I think, and that comes out of some social science research, that's one way to help. But it's a big problem, and it's going to take time and lots of effort.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Caitlin Shine. I'm with Carnegie Institution for Science, but I am an anthropologist, and I went to Arizona State.
I think you're going to have to speak a little louder.
Okay, I just need to get closer to the mic, I think. So I currently work in research development, and one thing that I have shared with our scientists is that when they're preparing proposals, they should be thinking about administrative priorities, agency strategic priorities, National Academies reports, these kinds of things, and couching their research in the context of some of these. But I think that for some scientists that comes naturally, especially astronomers. But for other scientists, it doesn't feel authentic for them, and they struggle to do that. So what is your guidance on and sort of helping our academic researchers appreciate the importance of figuring out where their science fits in that larger context?
Well, I salute you for even trying. I mean, really getting to the different norms of different disciplines. I mean, I'm so glad you raised the astronomers. In social science, I would raise the economists, right? There are norms and different fields that are just a lot more sort of disciplined. I mean, the sort of decadal surveys that people can agree upon. I mean, I think that would never happen. I'll talk about my own field. Never happen in sociology. I never think you could ever get 100 sociologists to agree on what we're going to do for the next 10 years, let alone for the next 10 minutes. But I do think that as people are trying to, but I do think it's the case that many scientists, not all, but many, and many social scientists want their work to have impact. And I think really get very frustrated by the fact that, but I've done this paper, and doesn't everybody know that I've got this thing to contribute to this huge national debate? It's like, no, they do not know. In part because I think sometimes our kind of broader impacts, or the thing that we put on the grant in that last section when we're exhausted and we have to come up with 300 words, is like, I'm going to put up a website and nobody's ever going to see it, but we think it's going to sort of drive. So I think one of the arguments to your really great question about true scientists, social scientists, natural scientists, is if you want the work to have impact, you need to be engaging in a larger conversation with a larger group of stakeholders about what research does and means in the world. And so that's an incentive for them to read policy documents, read National Academies reports, indeed get involved in some of those consensus studies and some of that work as well.
Thank you. Well, we have time for one more question, and that's,
Dr. York.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. Travis York, for those that don't know me. As Alondra mentioned, I work at AAAS, but also have the pleasure of helping lead the STEM Opportunity Alliance, which we founded earlier this December in partnership with now over 130 organizations. And Alondra was one of the thought leaders behind that work. Thank you so much for your continued support with us. Through our work together, I know that you are a champion for systems change and strategic thinking around that. And one of the things I'm hoping that you might kind of illuminate for some of us are, as a part of SOA, which, by the way, we're releasing today, I'm very excited about this, our penultimate draft for a national strategy for STEM excellence and equity. It'll be open for public comment, and we really encourage people
Let's just put a flag on, like, it's open for public comment,
Yeah.
a strategy, right, for the nation. And also that you've done a lot of public engagement along the way. I think it's an extraordinary, a lot of our conversation's been about trust. It's an extraordinary example in how you do that. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. So far, over almost 800 people have already given input to the work, which is really the people's work.
I know.
As we think about those sorts of national strategies, one of the things that we oftentimes talk about is finding the kind of keystone species or keystone levers that really will affect many other sort of kind of downstream and ecosystem kind of chain of effects. And I'm curious to hear from you. What are some of those big kind of ticket items that, that in your work, in really thinking about public-private partnerships and bold collaborations, what are some of the spaces that you really would maybe encourage us to, forge ahead in radically different ways because of the, halo effect of those sorts of, addressing those critical issues or making change in particular areas that would continue to drive progress across the STEM ecosystem?
Thank you for that question. So I'll offer one sort of cautionary tale or sort of negative example, and then maybe we'll forecast to some future ones. So one of the things that was deeply impactful for me, and this is, I think there's some NSF colleagues here, was thinking about the fate of Arecibo kind of observatory in Puerto Rico. And I think those of us just who think about science and investments were like, it's rusty, it's old, it looks like something, it's showing its age and it needs to come down. But what we didn't, I think, anticipate, and so much praise to Ponch for really kind of thinking this through. And I think I'm coming back and and working with the community on this, is that people were like, my whole childhood was here. This is why I became a scientist. Like if you read, there's a beautiful essay in the New Yorker about this, actually. It literally anchored an entire community for more than a generation. And so we have to appreciate that our science and technology investments do all of this other work that holds communities together, that makes them proud about scientific achievement in their communities, that in all the things that we want science to do, that inspires people to work in astronomy and the STEM fields and the like. And so that's a case in which, we were able to do something with that facility, and it's going to remain in the community in a way. But to me, that's a cautionary tale about that we need to appreciate that, the expansion of Micron, fabs that are being put up in Idaho, or, like all of this kind of investment that's coming out of Gypsum Science and IRA, these new kind of, EV battery factories, contentious on the labor space, but, they're going to transform communities in South Carolina. And so how do we do that? Like, how do we do that in a way that is sort of, these are the societies that we want to build and make? What are the opportunities? Are there good jobs? Are they clean jobs? Are there safe jobs for people? Are we building childcare and schools and the like that support them? So I think that we just are beginning to do this. So I don't have any sort of perfect examples of how we've done it right, Travis. But I think that what I've appreciated about the debates about AI policy and governance, particularly the workers' role in this, has been people saying, we understand that these things have a role to play down the road and in our lives. And we're going to sort of, I don't know anything about a semiconductor, I don't know anything about, machine learning, but I know that AI is going to transform the way I do my work potentially. And I have something to say about that. So I would just offer, I think, method, right? Like, a lot of the questions have been around sort of expanding our method for how we think about science policy and research investments to include broader voices. And that is hard. And people are the chasm of power, the chasm of knowledge. If there's been kind of historical mistrust, people are going to yell at you. I mean, like, they're just like, it is a hard and complicated and thorny thing to do. But I think it's worth it, and it's the thing that we must do, and all of the work across civil society and government in this space.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That really has been wonderful. Adriana wanted to say a few words, and I know we're close to the time you need to leave, but okay, Adriana, please.
Well, thank you everyone for being here. I just want to close by thanking Dr. Nelson for being here with us. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and wisdom. Hopefully we can continue these conversations and collaborations. Thank you to Barbara for co-hosting this event. It's been really enjoyable. Also, thank you to Mike for the opportunity to be here and organize events with Section X. So this is our first event, hopefully more to come in the fall next year, so stay tuned. And then thank you to Felice, who can be here, Section K, and also ARA for hosting us here for this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. And can we please give a very large round of applause to Dr. Nelson? You were saying a fabulous interactive session, and I would like you are all invited. Lunch is around the corner, so we would love to have you. To those people that are online, if you were here, we would invite you too. So anyway, thank you again. We've had a very lively discussion. This was just wonderful. Thank you so much. It really was wonderful. Really wonderful.